Welcome to episode 6 of First Downs and Touchdowns. This is also going to be episode 2 on digital streaming platforms with Spotify and Apple Podcasts. But today, we are going to react to the college football playoff bracket, which should be a lot of fun. I have some resumes in front of me of these teams. Should they make it? Should they not? Did the committee get it right? And then you also have some teams that may have been snubbed, but it's like 4 teams I maybe found. But welcome to the show here. We are going to get started. I'm going to give you a description of the playoff bracket, what we have going on matchup-wise, and the 4 teams that got a bye. Then we're going to dive right into this thing. Starting with the 4 teams that have a bye. Number 1 is Oregon, the best team in the country this year. Well-deserved. The committee did get it right on that one. They are the best team, led by Dan Lanning. So can't really debate that one. They're the best team in the country. Then at 2, you have Georgia, which makes sense considering they beat Texas twice this year. You have Boise State. Then you have Arizona State. So that's your 4 teams getting a bye. Then you get into the matchups. Ohio State is going to host Tennessee. So that's 8 versus 9. And then you have Texas, 5 ranked, versus 12 Clemson. I have a problem with that. Later on, I'll let you know why. And then you have 6 Penn State taking on 11 SMU. And then Notre Dame is going to host number 10 Indiana. So that's the playoff bracket for you. But here's where the resume and maybe a team that got snubbed kicks in. So, of course, everybody knows Alabama is the biggest team that's being talked about right now. Got some facts to back up why they could have possibly made it. Strength of schedule, ranked 18th. Then you have, yes, their losses. Tennessee. Then they lost to Vanderbilt and then Oklahoma. The Vanderbilt and Oklahoma losses were devastating to their college football playoff hopes. 9-3 record on the season. Their wins, though, should get more elevation. You beat Georgia. You beat Missouri when they were ranked 34-0. Then you beat LSU. Even if they're not ranked now, they still beat a very good LSU team led by Garrett Nussmeier. That should be considered because they won 42-13 in a dominating fashion. And then you beat South Carolina before they were ranked. I mean, come on now, folks. I mean, we got to put that South Carolina win up there a little bit more. But here's where things might get a little dicey. 5 ranked teams. You have 2 teams that are no longer ranked, LSU and Missouri. But then the 3 teams that are ranked are Tennessee, South Carolina, and Georgia. So that puts you 3-2 against this kind of spread if they were all ranked. But having a tough SEC schedule shouldn't put you down in the dumps. You've played multiple ranked teams, even if they're ranked, not ranked, like I said. Alabama maybe got a little snubbed. And I'll tell you, there's 2 teams that maybe they could have made it over as SMU and Indiana. Once we get into their resumes later, you'll understand that maybe it could have happened. Ole Miss had a shot, but then again, they lost to Florida, Kentucky, and LSU. LSU, they lost at the end of that game on a game-winning touchdown. They lost 29-26, but they're 2 losses that kind of put them out of this for real, and it's why they're not here. They lost to Florida and they lost to Kentucky. 2 terrible losses. Kentucky under Coach Stoops isn't good. They're no good. Other than that, you did have some good wins against Georgia and South Carolina, but I think the bad outweighs the good here, unfortunately. Miami could have been a team that snuck in. I would have loved to see Miami sneak in some way, somehow. But when you're in too many close games with teams and you lose to Syracuse, they kind of put the nail in the coffin for them. Miami was in many close games. You had Virginia Tech, which was that Hail Mary questionable call game. And then you had Georgia Tech that they lost. The Georgia Tech loss as well never helped their cause as well. Duke, good team this year, but Miami outpowered them at one point. Then you had Louisville, who's a good team. I just think that, with playing too many close games and you took a couple losses to Syracuse and Georgia Tech, I think that kind of took you out of the conversation, unfortunately. But maybe you could have made it over SMU. I don't see why not. That's a team that could have been debated at least a little bit. Somebody could have made a cause for them to possibly make it. SMU and Indiana, as you were going to hear throughout this podcast, are probably two teams that shouldn't have made it despite their record or what they did this season. South Carolina, interestingly enough, they beat Texas A&M at one point when they were ranked, Missouri when they were ranked, and they beat Clemson very recently 17-14. And then but their losses were LSU, but when you took losses to Ole Miss and Bama, that kind of sealed the deal. They'll have the tiebreakers over you, so that sealed the deal for them. But now is where we get into resumes. Oregon, as I mentioned, best team in the country. Wins against Boise State, Ohio State, and Illinois, and then against Penn State in the Big Ten Championship. So it's 4 wins right there that are huge and determine that you're the best team in the country. That's 4 ranked teams that you beat. But there's not too much to discuss here. There is one point, though, that was interesting to me when I was listening to some podcasts the past couple of days. Joe Klatt, if you listen to his podcast of college football, the Joe Klatt Show, he made a point of reseeding in the second round to reward the number 1 seed in the country, which I find interesting. If you're not familiar with Joe Klatt, he is a former Colorado quarterback, used to play in his days of playing football. Solid quarterback, and he has analysis that I enjoy and value a lot. But that point was interesting. It's had me think as of recently, could you do that to reward the number 1 team? But sometimes I think when you're the number 1 team, you should be challenged to prove that you're the best team in the country. I mean, that's just how I feel about it. Then after that is the Boise State SMU conversation. Boise State, you almost beat Oregon, which I understand you could give them a little leeway considering they only lost by 3 points, 34-31. And you won against UNLV, who was ranked as well, and they're still ranked. But come on. The Mountain West, where nobody plays, I mean, Nevada, that's not a team. I'm going to look up the Mountain West here real quick, and I'm going to just name off some teams that I don't know. Would you ever really play them? I don't think so. Nevada is one of the teams that I mentioned, but we're going to go through this because I do think it's important to understand the rankings and how the teams fell. Conference rankings. All right, here we go. So when you look here, hold on, Mountain West. I'm going to list these teams' names off. Colorado State, I could understand, but there's 3 teams in the Mountain West here where they were good. Colorado State, UNLV, and Boise State. That's 3 teams. Cool. But Nevada, Wyoming, San Diego State, Air Force literally won a game this year without throwing a pass, which is one of those things that's rare. Utah State, Hawaii, New Mexico, San Jose State. There's just not a lot of heavy hitting teams in the Mountain West, which is why I don't understand why they are the 3 seed. And I understand that they won the conference championship in the Mountain West. But why is Clemson ranked 12th when they won the ACC championship? You're telling me you're just going to put them in when they beat SMU? That's where things get backwards with me and the committee. And speaking of SMU, strength of schedule, 57th rank. But you want to talk about strength of schedule for Boise State, 78th rank. So just keep that in mind. But then you look at SMU, strength of schedule 57th ranked, like I mentioned, loss against Clemson, the ACC championship, and loss against BYU. That's 0-2 against current ranked top 25 teams. The ACC is weak this year as well. They played some, there are some good teams. Louisville, Duke finished well. BC finished pretty solid. But Pitt lost the last 5 games. They were 7-0 and lost the last 5 games. SMU did beat Pitt when they were ranked, but that's where I kind of am like, yeah, they were ranked at one point there. But considering how Pitt finished, I feel like you could dock some credibility there. But the combined record of the teams they did play in the ACC is 47-49. Those teams didn't even combine to finish better than 500. So that's where I kind of get a little dicey and a little iffy on if SMU has a legit resume to be where they are. If you look at the bracket, SMU was the 11th seed and Clemson was the 12th seed. But explain to me how the ACC champion in Clemson is ranked below SMU. If the committee values the championship game, SEC, Big 12, Big 10, SEC, stuff like that in the Power 4 conferences, then why isn't Clemson ranked higher? That's what I want to know from the committee. That's why it doesn't make sense to me. But then here's one thing the committee did get right. Georgia and Texas. Georgia beat Texas twice. And that's where that makes sense for Georgia to jump up to the 2 seed and for Georgia to fall back to the 5 seed. Texas lost 30-15 and then 22-19 in overtime in the SEC championship. Georgia's schedule, they lost against Alabama and they lost against Ole Miss. Those are 2 losses, but you have 2 wins against Texas, a win against Tennessee, and a win against Clemson, which puts you 4-2 against top 25 teams that are currently ranked right now. So I understand the Georgia jumping up, and the Texas falling to 5 makes sense, considering that their only 2 top 25 potential wins were Georgia, and they lost them. And for Texas, they got lucky getting a cupcake schedule for their first year in the SEC. They came over from the Big 12 with Oklahoma to the SEC. So I can understand that there. I think the committee got the Georgia-Texas part right. Then Arizona State. Really love this team's story, right? You got 60 new players that come over. You are predicted to finish last in the Big 12. Dillingham's coach of the year. Very well deserved with how he coached that team and how they took some big wins. Very well deserved coach of the year in the Big 12. They took a win against BYU. They also took a beating win against Iowa State. They absolutely smashed Iowa State 45-19. Wasn't even close. Iowa State got to 19 points, but it was like, at the end of the game. So kind of like shrug, kind of like, whatever. Cam Scattaboo. What a running back for that team. He is a absolute bowling ball, just running through people. Really good balance for a running back as well, who's got that big size to him, knows how to stay on his feet and get the extra yards, the yards after contact, which is huge. Really like him. Sam Levitt, I really like how he produced for that offense. So the team having talent like that is huge. They also took a win against Kansas State when they were ranked. So I'm putting that in their resume because that was huge, because now, since the loss against Iowa State, they are no longer ranked. So taking that win when Kansas State was ranked was huge. Then we get to Notre Dame. This is an interesting kind of team right here, considering they're an independent team in the FBS. No conference, no SEC, no ACC, none of the big Power 4 conferences. They're by themselves. They're 1-0 against current top 25 teams and 22 Army. Army is a fantastic team this year. They just know how to win games with their game plan they have each game. Well, then when you look at the W's outside of Army, they did take a loss to Northern Illinois, which was a hilarious loss in my opinion. I don't know how that factored in, but we'll see. But their wins against Purdue, Miami, Louisville, Georgia Tech, Florida State, USC, Virginia, Texas A&M, and Navy. So when I did my research here, combined records here with Notre Dame, like I mentioned, USC, Army, all that, 64 and 56. So the combined teams did finish above 500, almost by about 10 games. So that does make sense why they jump up. And I don't think Notre Dame's going to ever join a conference. They may join the ACC, considering they like to play a lot of ACC teams. But for me, I think Notre Dame has the perfect resume to fit in some way, somehow. In 120 total games between all the combined records, you get 64 wins out of the combined records there. So that's good. You beat Louisville, who's a good team. That game was very close for a while. Georgia Tech being a good team, they beat them. Purdue seems to be showing up on a couple of these resumes, but Purdue was one of the worst teams in college football this year, finishing 1-11. They did have that debacle where the receiver didn't know where the back of the end zone was, which was funny. I felt bad for the dude at the moment, but he didn't know his boundaries, so that's on him. But Notre Dame, being independent, they won't ever join a conference, because when you get big TV money from NBC, you can play separate, you can be on TV all the time. Why would you not keep taking in that revenue? That's why I don't think Notre Dame's ever going to join a conference. But if it were, it'd probably be the ACC, in my opinion, considering how much they play. Getting to Clemson. Clemson makes sense, considering they were the ACC champion. I think they should be ranked higher. You took a loss against Georgia early in the year. I don't think you should be held. I don't think that should be held against Clemson. You did lose against South Carolina 17-14. But again, that was a close game and came down to the end. They did luck into the ACC championship, so maybe that's where I can understand the ranking low a little bit. But to be behind SMU, who you beat in the ACC championship, that doesn't make sense. So they did luck into the ACC championship with Miami losing 42-38 against Syracuse. So that makes sense. Then we get to Penn State. Penn State's an interesting case because you beat Illinois, but you lost against Ohio State and Oregon. Oregon in the Big Ten championship, but that still puts you 1-2 against the current ranked top 25 teams. 30th ranked in strength of schedule. I don't really see too many problems here. I could understand the 1-2 record against top 25 teams being mentioned here, of how that can put them down a little bit. But I do think they have the capability to compete with a lot of these top 25 teams. And when they did lose, it was close games. Oregon, it was a little bit different. That was an absolute shootout. So not many issues there. I think it makes sense. They should have made it regardless. Ohio State could have possibly made it over them, but then again, they lost to Michigan and killed their chances of making the championship game. So them being over Ohio State does make sense. It would have been a different story if Ohio State won. Which then brings me to Ohio State. You have wins against Penn State, like I mentioned, and a blowout win against Indiana. Losses against Oregon. So that's 2-1 against the current top 25 teams. But I did write down this one win, like I mentioned, is Michigan. That is definitely going to be held against them, considering that Sharon Moore and Michigan were about 500 or under that for most of the season. Got to give credit to Sharon Moore here for how he managed to coach that team up. I really like his demeanor and how he can get these guys to win. I thought it was cool that when he's coaching these guys, he's saying, what can I do to beat Ohio State, considering that Michigan has Ohio State's number right now. So nothing really too bad here. Committee got it right with Ohio State sneaking them in. I wouldn't say sneaking them in, but getting them in. The Michigan loss did rank them down a little bit. If they made the Big Ten championship and possibly beat Oregon, I don't know if they could have. They could have, considering that they only lost by 1. So it's a little interesting there and how that could have changed the top 4 seeding and the seeding in general. But they got that right. Then the next one, Tennessee. I think they got this right They beat Bama, so you got the tiebreaker there, and you lost to Georgia, who's now the number 2 seed. So kind of makes sense. So you're 1-1 against current top 25 teams. You have a strength of schedule of 28. You beat Vandy you beat Vanderbilt when Bama lost. So that's also another big thing that the committee probably took into consideration. So I don't have a problem with Nico Iamaleava in Tennessee making the playoffs. I think that should be a fun game against Ohio State. But here's the team. One of the other teams I have a problem with is Indiana. 0-1 against current top 25 teams. Ohio State. You want to know who else they played outside of that with the Big Ten schedule? They played UCLA, Maryland, Northwestern, Nebraska, Washington, Michigan, Michigan State, and Purdue. The combined record of these teams is 38-58. I understand the 11-1 record. That's understandable and how Kurt Cignetti turned the program around. But 38-58 combined record of the Big Ten teams you played on your schedule. Pretty cupcake schedule, if I say so myself. Michigan, they barely beat Michigan. Michigan almost won that game because Indiana could not score in the second half. I don't know how Indiana made it. I understand the record for Indiana and how they turned things around. But you're telling me that team's more worth it than Bama, who played a higher strength of schedule? That's where I don't get, because Indiana, their strength of schedule is 67th ranked. I don't get it, because 18 versus 67th ranked in the country for strength of schedule doesn't add up. I think Bama got robbed. I would have put them over Indiana or SMU, and I would have ranked Clemson a little higher, like I mentioned. But that's where I draw the line, because Indiana, yes, you have Nebraska, who finished 500 or better, a little bit slightly, just right there with Dylan Raiola. I expect them to be better. I mean, Michigan 7-5. It's just one of those things where I don't get it. So, yeah. Very weak schedule there in the Big Ten. So I don't think they should make it or have a bid. But that's really where I stand with a lot of these teams and how I feel about the college football playoff. For me, I think we're still going to get great games regardless, but I think Bama not making it over someone like an SMU or Indiana is terrible. I'm not saying they got completely robbed, but when you look at the stats afterwards and see that Bama played a harder schedule compared to Indiana and SMU, it makes sense. I mean, Indiana's got some good talent. They got D'Angelo Pons at corner. Is one of the guys I really like from there. And he's a part of that group of talent who just is fantastic. But Indiana playing that cupcake schedule they did, to me, I would put Indiana ahead of them. So that's where I stand with the college football playoff. It's going to be fun. Starts December 20th. Get ready, folks, because we're about to see a new champion. And if I had to put a top 3 here of teams I think that could win, I think Oregon has a strong chance to win it. They're the best team in the country this year. A lot of talent on that team. Tez Johnson, Evan Stewart, Terrence Ferguson, Dylan Gabriel, Jordan James. You got Jabbar Muhammad in the secondary for Oregon. I think Arizona has a chance to make some noise as well under Dillingham. I think they can make it to near the end, but it would be cool to see him make a large run, make some noise. Penn State, they could beat SMU, but I think they'll fall apart. But the main teams I have is Oregon. I think that you could see Georgia there, but it depends on Carson Beck's healthiness. But Stockton played fantastic, stepping in the SEC championship. Tennessee has a chance because that team's really good. But Oregon, I would say Tennessee, Arizona State, Georgia, and possibly, depending on quarterback play, Texas going. Or Ohio State. Texas or Ohio State would be the last team I'd think that has a legit shot. But that's going to do here for today's podcast. Make sure to follow me up here on the socials up here. Be much appreciated. Also, you can find the podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Make sure to follow it there. Leave a review as well if possible. And we got some more good content coming, some NFL previews to have near the end of the week. So that's going to be fun. But that's going to do here for this episode of First Downs and Touchdowns. I'm your host, Nate Skinner. Peace.